January 4th, 1945. Dawn had not yet broken over the snow-covered ridge outside Flamierge, Belgium. Staff Sergeant Isadore Jachman crouched in his foxhole, his breath forming white clouds in the -15-degree air. Through the grey light, he could hear the unmistakable sound that every infantry soldier had learned to dread. The grinding metallic growl of tank treads crushing frozen earth. The sound was getting closer. Jachman pressed himself against the frozen dirt wall of his position and looked left toward where his squad leader should have been. The foxhole was empty. To his right, he could see other men from Company B, 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment, peering over their positions toward the tree line, 400 yards ahead. They were lightly armed airborne troops, designed to drop behind enemy lines, not to face German armor in open combat. Yet here they were, dug into defensive positions west of Bastogne, watching the fog begin to lift and reveal what was coming toward them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 2 German tanks emerged from the morning mist. Behind them, Jachman could see infantry moving in squad formations. The tanks were Panzer Mark IV medium tanks, 30-ton vehicles mounting 75mm guns and protected by 80mm of frontal armor. Against such machines, Company B had rifles, a few machine guns, and whatever anti-tank weapons they could scrounge. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. Without effective anti-tank defense, those 2 panzers would methodically destroy every position along the American line. The lead tank traversed its turret, searching for targets, then it fired. The 75mm shell exploded against the frozen ground 30 yards to Jachman's left. Dirt and snow cascaded down. Men screamed. The second tank fired into a different section of the line. Another explosion. More screaming. Company B was being torn apart, and the German infantry hadn't even reached effective rifle range yet. This was not how Isadore Jachman had imagined his war would end, but perhaps it was fitting. He had been born in Berlin, Germany, on December 14th, 1922, the first son of Leo and Lotte Jachman. The family had immigrated to Baltimore, Maryland, when Isadore was 2 years old, fleeing the rising tide of anti-Semitism that would soon consume Europe. His parents had given him something precious, a new life in America, a chance to grow up in a country where being Jewish didn't mark you for destruction. He had graduated from Baltimore City College High School in 1939, just months before Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht invaded Poland. While Jachman spent a year studying physical education at the University of Baltimore, Nazi Germany was conquering France, bombing London, and implementing policies that would ultimately murder 6 million Jews, including 6 of Jachman's own aunts and uncles who had remained in Europe. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, there was never any question about where Isadore Jachman's loyalties lay. He registered for the draft in Baltimore in late June 1942. He could have waited to be called. Instead, he volunteered, not just for infantry service, but specifically for paratrooper training. The paratroopers went first, dropped deepest into enemy territory, faced the most dangerous missions. That was exactly where Jachman wanted to be. By January 1945, Staff Sergeant Jachman had survived the brutal airborne training at Fort Benning, Georgia, earned his jump wings, and crossed the Atlantic with the 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the newly activated 17th Airborne Division. The division's shoulder patch showed a golden talon against a black circle, representing thunder from heaven. They were the last American airborne division to reach the European theatre, arriving in England in August 1944, just as the breakout from Normandy was transforming into a race across France. For months, the 17th Airborne waited in England for their combat jump. They trained relentlessly, studied aerial photographs of German positions, and prepared for the mission that would send them into action. But operational plans changed constantly. Proposed airborne operations were cancelled as ground forces advanced faster than expected. The division remained in reserve while their sister units, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, fought through Holland during Operation Market Garden. Then came December 16th, 1944. On that morning, 25 German divisions, supported by hundreds of tanks and over 1,000 artillery pieces, smashed through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest of Belgium. Adolf Hitler had gambled everything on one final offensive, aiming to split the Allied armies, recapture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. German planners called it Operation Watch on the Rhine. The Americans would call it the Battle of the Bulge, named for the massive salient driven into Allied lines. The German attack achieved complete tactical surprise. Entire American units were overrun or surrounded. The Green troops of the 106th Infantry Division suffered catastrophic losses. The vital crossroads town of Bastogne was surrounded. The weather turned brutally cold, with fog and snow grounding Allied aircraft that might have provided support. For the first time since the Normandy breakout, German forces held the initiative, and the outcome of the entire Western campaign hung in the balance. On December 23rd, the 17th Airborne Division received emergency orders. Elements of the division were flown from England to the Reims area of France in spectacular night flights, transport aircraft threading through winter storms to deliver paratroopers to the crisis. These units closed at Mourmelon, the same base the 101st Airborne had occupied before being rushed to Bastogne. On December 25th, Christmas Day, the 17th Airborne took over defence of a sector along the Meuse River, from Givet to Verdun, establishing a final defensive line should German spearheads break through. But defence was not what the division had trained for, and it was not what their commander, Major General William Miley, intended. On January 3, 1945, the 17th Airborne marched through deep snow to Morhet, Belgium, relieving the exhausted 28th Infantry Division. General George Patton, newly assigned command of this sector, believed the Germans were in full retreat after being stopped at Bastogne. He ordered the 17th Airborne to attack immediately, driving northeast toward Houffalize to link up with First Army forces pushing south. The operational conditions were appalling. Snow lay waist-deep in many areas, temperatures plunged well below zero, fog limited visibility to a few dozen yards, air support was impossible, artillery support was inadequate, intelligence about enemy positions was sketchy at best. The lightly armed paratroopers and glidermen of the 17th Airborne were being ordered to assault German armour and infantry in prepared defensive positions under winter conditions that would have challenged even fully equipped mechanised units. The 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment, Jachman's unit, received orders to strike north on January 4th, attacking from the vicinity of Monty toward the villages of Flamierge and Flamierge, with the objective of reaching the Authe River. The plan called for a short artillery preparation, followed by an infantry assault across open, snow-covered ground against entrenched German forces. Intelligence reports indicated the enemy included elements of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division and the Führer-Begleit Brigade, elite units equipped with tanks, self-propelled guns, and veteran infantry. At 0830 hours on January 4th, American artillery opened fire. For 15 minutes, shells screamed overhead and exploded in the German positions. Then the barrage lifted, and Company B, along with the rest of the regiment, began moving forward through the snow. The attack made progress at first. 1st and 2nd Battalions advanced toward their objectives, encountering scattered resistance from German infantry positions. But as 3rd Battalion crested the high ground overlooking Flamierge, they ran into the main defensive line. Mortar fire began falling. Machine guns opened up from concealed positions. Self-propelled guns engaged from hull-down positions along the ridge. The advance slowed, then stalled. Company B was part of this assault. They had gained ground but taken casualties. The wounded cried out for medics. The dead lay where they fell in the snow. Ammunition ran low as men fired at muzzle flashes and shadows in the fog. Sergeants shouted orders, trying to organize a coordinated push against the German positions. Then the 2 tanks appeared. They came from the left flank, emerging from dead ground that the Americans hadn't adequately reconnoitred. The panzers moved deliberately, their commanders knowing that their armor made them nearly invulnerable to anything the paratroopers possessed. They would take their time, systematically destroying each American position, supporting the German infantry counterattack that would drive the 513th back down the ridge. The effect on Company B was immediate and devastating. Men who had been advancing or holding positions now scrambled for whatever cover they could find. The tanks fired again and again, each shell finding American positions. One foxhole disappeared in a direct hit. Another explosion threw bodies into the air. The German infantry began advancing behind the armor, firing as they came. The company was being destroyed, and there was nothing the paratroopers could do about it. They had no tank destroyers. Their 57mm anti-tank guns had been left behind because they were too heavy for airborne operations. The bazookas they possessed, M9 and M9A1 rocket launchers, had limited effectiveness against tank frontal armor, and most of the bazooka teams had already been hit or had exhausted their ammunition. Staff Sergeant Isadore Jachman watched the tanks methodically working their way along the American line. He saw men dying. He saw positions being overrun. He saw Company B dissolving under the German assault. Somewhere along that line, a bazooka team had been hit. The gunner was down. The loader was down. The weapon lay in the snow, useless, while two German tanks prepared to finish the destruction of Company B. The military mathematics were clear. Without those tanks being stopped, the entire company would be killed or captured. The regiment's attack would fail. The 17th Airborne's first combat operation would end in defeat. More American soldiers would die in subsequent attacks trying to take this same ground. The Battle of the Bulge would drag on longer, costing more lives, prolonging the war. Everything hinged on stopping those two tanks. Jachman looked at the bazooka lying in the snow 80 yards ahead. He looked at the tanks, now less than 100 yards away. He looked at his comrades, pinned in their positions, unable to move without being cut down. Then he made his decision. To understand what drove Isadore Jachman to do what he did next, you must understand the weapon he was about to use and why every fiber of military doctrine said what he was planning was suicide. The M9A1 bazooka was a 2.36-inch rocket launcher that had entered service in mid-1944 as an improvement over earlier models. It weighed just over 15 pounds and consisted of a steel tube 61 inches long that could be broken down into two sections for easier transport, a simple trigger mechanism at the midpoint connected to a magneto-firing system that sent an electrical charge to the rocket's igniter. The weapon had a crude wire shoulder rest and used either iron sights or, on later models, an optical reflector sight for aiming. The ammunition was the M6A3 high-explosive anti-tank rocket, a shaped charge warhead designed to penetrate armor through the Monroe effect. Upon impact, the shaped charge would create a jet of superheated metal traveling at over 20,000 feet per second, capable of burning through 4 inches of armor plate. In theory, against the side or rear armor of German tanks, where protection was thinner, the bazooka could achieve kills. Against frontal armor, especially on heavier German vehicles, penetration was far from guaranteed. More critically, the bazooka was a crew-served weapon requiring 2 men for optimal operation. The gunner aimed and fired. The loader armed the weapon, inserting the rocket from the rear, connecting the electrical leads, and tapping the gunner's helmet to signal ready. After firing, the loader immediately prepared the next round, while the gunner acquired a new target. This 2-man operation allowed for a sustained rate of fire of approximately 10 rounds per minute. Operating the weapon alone was possible but drastically reduced effectiveness. The shooter had to shoulder the launcher, aim, fire, then lower the weapon, move to the rear, load a new rocket, check the electrical connection, return to firing position, re-aim, and fire again. This process took time that a soldier under fire did not have, time that allowed enemy tanks to identify the shooter's position and engage with their main guns or machine guns. The tactical doctrine for bazooka employment emphasized concealment, surprise, and immediate displacement after firing. Bazooka teams were taught to hide in buildings, behind walls, in tree lines. anywhere that provided cover and concealment. They would wait until tanks were at close range, ideally within 100 yards, and moving past their position, exposing side or rear armor. The team would fire, score a hit, then immediately displace to a new position before the enemy could return fire. What doctrine absolutely did not recommend was standing in the open, exposed to enemy fire, attempting to operate a bazooka single-handedly while two tanks concentrated their weapons on your position. That was exactly what Isadore Jachman was about to do. He rose from his foxhole and began running forward through the snow. German machine gun fire immediately tracked toward him. Bullets snapped past his head. Mortar rounds exploded to his left and right. The nearest tank's turret began traversing, the commander having spotted movement and directing the gunner to engage. Jachman kept running, his boots breaking through the snow crust, his lungs burning in the frigid air. He reached the fallen bazooka team. One man was clearly dead, his body torn by machine gun fire. The other was badly wounded, clutching his side, unable to speak. The bazooka lay in the snow beside them, the M9A1 launcher with its two-piece tube still assembled. Jachman grabbed the weapon, checked that it was intact, then looked for ammunition. The canvas carrier held 3 rockets in tubes. 2 were visible. That gave Jachman at least 2 shots, possibly 3 if he could find more ammunition from the casualties' gear. 2 shots against 2 tanks. The lead tank was now less than 70 yards away, its turret still traversing toward his position. The gunner was looking for him through the commander's vision port. Machine guns from both tanks were firing in his direction. Every instinct screamed at Jachman to find cover, to get behind something, anything, that would stop bullets and shell fragments. But there was no cover. The ridge was open ground, snow-covered fields broken only by scattered foxholes. If he stayed, still, the tanks would kill him. If he ran, the tanks would kill everyone else. He had perhaps 10 seconds before the lead tank's main gun bore on his position and fired. Jachman shouldered the bazooka. The weight felt awkward without a loader to help stabilize the rear of the launcher. He planted his feet in the snow, trying to create a stable firing platform. Through the optical sight, he could see the lead panzer, its turret now facing directly toward him. The tank commander's hatch was open. He could see the German officer's face, see him shouting orders to the gunner. This was the moment when training and instinct had to override the rational part of his brain that was screaming about the suicide he was committing, the part that calculated the odds of survival at something approaching 0, the part that wanted to live, to return to Baltimore, to see his family again, to have a future beyond this frozen Belgian ridge. Isadore Jachman squeezed the trigger. The magneto sparked. The electrical charge travelled down the lead to the rocket's igniter. The solid propellant ignited, and the M6A3 rocket left the launch tube with a distinctive whoosh that every soldier in Company B recognized. A plume of white smoke and flame shot from the rear of the bazooka. The rocket streaked across the 70 yards, separating Jachman from the tank, its trajectory slightly erratic due to the crosswind. The German tank commander saw the rocket coming. He had perhaps half a second to react. Not enough time to order evasive maneuvers, not enough time to close his hatch, only enough time to realize what was about to happen. The rocket struck the Panzer Mark IV on its frontal hull, just below the turret ring. The shaped charge detonated. The Monroe effect focused the explosive force into a jet of superheated metal that burned through the tank's armor plate. Inside the crew compartment, the penetrating jet killed the driver instantly and ignited ammunition stored in the forward hull. Secondary explosions began cooking off, sending gouts of flame through every opening in the tank. The German crew began bailing out. The commander leaped from his hatch. The gunner tried to squeeze through the turret opening. The loader pushed from behind, trying to escape the inferno. Within seconds, the first tank was disabled, its crew scrambling away through the snow, the vehicle burning with thick black smoke. But Jachman had no time to celebrate. The second tank had identified his position. Its turret was traversing. The coaxial machine gun began firing, 7.92mm rounds tearing through the air where Jachman stood. He dropped to the snow, The bazooka clutched to his chest as bullets cracked overhead. He had to reload, had to fire again, had to stop the second tank before it could resume firing on Company B's positions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Working as fast as his cold-numbed fingers allowed, Jachman moved to the rear of the launcher, pulled a rocket from the carrier, and began inserting it into the tube. The electrical lead had to be connected. The rocket had to be seated properly. The safety wire had to be removed. German infantry had now identified his position. Rifle fire began snapping around him. Mortar teams adjusted their aim, and shells began falling closer. The second tank was less than 50 yards away, moving forward to get a better angle on the American positions, its commander confident that whoever had fired at the first tank would be dead in moments. Jachman finished loading, scrambled back to firing position, shouldered the bazooka again, and acquired the second tank through the optical sight. This one was moving, traversing its turret, with its machine guns firing. Multiple streams of tracer fire converged on Jachman's position. The German tank commander was shouting into his radio, coordinating with the infantry, calling for more support. Jachman aimed at the tank's flank, now partially exposed as it maneuvered. He adjusted for the target's movement, adjusted for windage. The tank's main gun was almost bearing on him. He could see down the barrel of the 75mm cannon. In approximately 2 seconds, that gun would fire, and he would cease to exist. He squeezed the trigger again. The second rocket launched. This time the trajectory was true, the windage calculated correctly. The rocket hit the Panzer on its side armor, penetrating the thinner plate protecting the crew compartment. The shaped charge burned through, and the resulting internal explosion wounded the crew and disabled the vehicle's drive system. The tank lurched to a stop, its tracks seized. Smoke began pouring from the engine compartment. The German crew bailed out of the second tank. Some were wounded. All were desperate to escape before the ammunition exploded. They stumbled through the snow, some crawling, others limping, trying to reach the safety of their infantry lines. With both tanks knocked out, the German assault collapsed. The infantry, now without armor support, were exposed to American rifle and machine gun fire. Mortar teams that had been aggressively advancing now pulled back. The entire enemy attack, which moments before had been on the verge of overrunning Company B, suddenly lost all momentum. But for Isadore Jachman, the victory was brief. In the seconds after he fired the second shot, multiple German weapons concentrated their fire on his position. Rifle bullets struck him. Machine gun fire from German infantry positions tore through his body. A mortar round exploded close enough that the blast effect threw him backward into the snow. He had taken fatal wounds. At 22 years old, Staff Sergeant Isadore Siegfried Jachman was dying on a Belgian ridge, 80 yards from the tanks he had destroyed. Medics tried to reach him, but German fire was too intense. Company B soldiers returned fire, trying to suppress the enemy weapons, trying to give the medics a chance. Several men were hit, attempting the rescue. By the time they finally reached Jachman, he was already gone. The battle for the ridge continued throughout January 4th. The 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment pushed forward, taking Flamierge by nightfall, though German counterattacks would force a temporary withdrawal. Over the following week, the 17th Airborne would fight one of the most brutal engagements of the entire Battle of the Bulge, a 3-day battle for Dead Man's Ridge that would cost the division nearly 1,000 casualties. The ridge earned its name from the bodies of American and German soldiers who littered the snow-covered heights. But on January 4th, Company B held its position because 2 German tanks had been knocked out at the critical moment. The regiment achieved its objectives because one man had seen what needed to be done and had done it, knowing it would cost his life. The broader American counteroffensive continued, driving German forces back, eliminating the Bulge, setting the stage for the final Allied push into Germany. Isadore Jachman's body was recovered and initially buried in a temporary military cemetery in Belgium. His personal effects were collected and sent to his family in Baltimore. His parents received a telegram informing them that their son had been killed in action. The loss devastated the family, as such losses devastated thousands of American families that winter. What Jachman's parents did not immediately learn was how their son had died. The full story emerged slowly, pieced together from after-action reports, eyewitness statements from Company B survivors, and the official Medal of Honor investigation conducted after the battle. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tully, commander of the 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment, wrote in his after-action report, Staff Sergeant Jachman's single-handed assault on 2 enemy tanks saved Company B from destruction and allowed the regiment to continue its attack. His action was the most conspicuous display of gallantry I have witnessed in this campaign. Soldiers from Company B who survived the battle provided statements describing what they had seen. Private First Class Robert Mitchell stated, "I watched Sergeant Jachman run through machine gun fire to reach that bazooka. He stood in the open and fired at those tanks like he was on a training range. I've never seen anything braver. He saved all our lives." Corporal James Sullivan, who had been wounded earlier in the action, later wrote, "When those tanks showed up, we thought we were done for. We had no way to stop them. Then Jachman grabbed that bazooka and went after them by himself. He must have known he wasn't coming back." The citation for Jachman's Medal of Honor read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty at Flamierge, Belgium, on 4 January 1945, when his company was pinned down by enemy artillery, mortar, and small arms fire, 2 hostile tanks attacked the unit, inflicting heavy casualties. Staff Sergeant Jachman, seeing the desperate plight of his comrades, left his place of cover and with total disregard for his own safety, dashed across open ground through a hail of fire and, seizing a bazooka from a fallen comrade, advanced on the tanks, which concentrated their fire on him. Firing the weapon alone, he damaged one and forced both to retire. Staff Sergeant Jachman's heroic action, in which he suffered fatal wounds, disrupted the entire enemy attack, reflecting the highest credit upon himself and the Parachute Infantry. The Medal of Honor was not presented to Jachman's family until June 1950, more than 5 years after his death. The delay was typical for the period, as the military conducted thorough investigations to ensure Medal of Honor recipients truly met the extraordinarily high standards required for America's highest military decoration. By the time the medal was finally awarded, Jachman's parents had already spent years grieving, already knew their son would never return, already had to build their lives around the permanent absence of their firstborn child. But the people of Flamierge had not forgotten. The small Belgian village had been liberated at terrible cost, with American and German bodies littering the streets and fields. The villagers knew that soldiers had died to free them from German occupation. They knew that one American soldier in particular had made a stand that turned the battle, though initially they did not know his name. In the years after the war, the people of Flamierge erected a monument. It depicted an American soldier standing with a bazooka, facing enemy tanks. The inscription read, "To the unknown American soldier who gave his life that our village might be free." For years, the statue stood as a tribute to an unnamed hero, representing all the Americans who had fought and died in the Ardennes that terrible winter. Then, in the late 1950s, a researcher from the U.S. Army Historical Division was studying Medal of Honor records and noticed the description of Jachman's actions matched perfectly with the monument in Flamierge. The location was exact, the date was correct. The description of a soldier with a bazooka engaging tanks matched what Jachman had done. The U.S. Army contacted Belgian authorities, who verified through local witnesses and German records that Jachman had indeed been the unknown soldier commemorated by the monument. Jachman's name was added to the statue. The unknown soldier finally had an identity. Today, visitors to Flamierge can see Staff Sergeant Isadore Siegfried Jachman's name carved into the monument, honoring the Jewish immigrant from Berlin who became an American paratrooper and gave his life to save his comrades and liberate a Belgian village from Nazi occupation. The tactical implications of Jachman's actions extended far beyond Company B's survival on January 4th. His demonstration that a single soldier with a bazooka could engage and destroy tanks under the most adverse conditions validated the weapon's utility and influenced how American infantry approached tank engagements for the remainder of the war. Throughout the final months of fighting in Europe, isolated examples of soldiers using bazookas to stop German armor appeared in after-action reports from multiple units. The Medal of Honor citation itself influenced subsequent awards. The Medal of Honor Board became more willing to recognize soldiers who took extraordinary individual action with standard infantry weapons against overwhelming enemy forces. Jachman's example showed that heroism was not limited to officers or to soldiers with special weapons, but could come from any man who saw a crisis and acted decisively. The psychological impact on German tank crews was subtler but real. Tank commanders who had grown accustomed to American infantry fleeing or surrendering when confronted with armor now had to consider that individual soldiers might attempt direct engagement. This added uncertainty degraded German armor effectiveness in infantry combat. Tank commanders became more cautious, more likely to button up in their vehicles, less willing to move aggressively through areas where infantry might be concealed. For the 17th Airborne Division, Jachman's sacrifice became part of the unit's identity. The division that had waited so long for combat, that had arrived late to the European theatre, that had been thrown into the brutal winter fighting of the Bulge with inadequate preparation, proved through battles like Flamierge that it could match the combat effectiveness of any unit in the army. The 17th would go on to make its first combat jump during Operation Varsity, the airborne assault across the Rhine in March 1945, conducting the largest single-day airborne operation of the war. Throughout these subsequent operations, soldiers of the 17th Airborne carried with them the memory of men like Jachman who had shown what was possible through individual courage. The broader strategic context makes Jachman's action even more significant. The Battle of the Bulge represented Adolf Hitler's final offensive gamble in the West. He had committed his last substantial reserves of men, tanks, and fuel in a desperate attempt to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. The failure of the offensive sealed Germany's fate. After the Bulge, German forces in the West could only retreat and delay. They lacked the strength to mount another major counterattack, but that failure required that every village, every crossroads, every ridge be contested. Places like Flamierge, small Belgian communities that most people had never heard of, became crucial battlegrounds where the outcome of the war was decided through the accumulated actions of thousands of individual soldiers. When Company B held its position on January 4th because 2 tanks were knocked out, that was one less section of German line that remained intact. One more breach in enemy defences. One more step toward final victory. The human cost of these small actions was staggering. The 17th Airborne Division suffered nearly 1,000 casualties in just 3 days of fighting around Flamierge and Dead Man's Ridge. The division that had entered combat on January 3, 1945, with approximately 12,000 men, would lose more than 3,000 killed, wounded, or missing by the time the Bulge was eliminated in late January. These casualty rates approached those suffered by units in the First World War, and they occurred in winter conditions that would have been considered unacceptable by peacetime military standards. The soldiers endured temperatures that regularly dropped below 0 Fahrenheit. They fought in snow that was often waist-deep. They suffered from frostbite, trench foot, and exposure injuries that disabled men as effectively as enemy fire. Supply lines struggled to deliver adequate food, ammunition, and winter clothing. Medical evacuation was complicated by snow-blocked roads and limited transport assets. Men fought while hungry, cold, exhausted, and knowing that if they were wounded, reaching a field hospital might take hours or even days. Under these conditions, the standards for heroism became recalibrated. In summer campaigns, a soldier might be considered brave for charging a machine gun position. In the winter Bulge, simply maintaining one's position, continuing to function despite frostbite and exhaustion, required a kind of sustained courage that often went unrecognized. The men who fought at Flamierge were already heroes for being there at all, for not surrendering to the overwhelming misery of their situation. What made Jachman's action extraordinary was not that he faced danger, Every man in Company B faced danger that day. What made it extraordinary was that when the mathematical logic of the situation said that someone would die but that death might save others, Jachman made the conscious decision to be that someone. He calculated the equation and assigned himself the role of necessary sacrifice. This requires understanding the specific psychology of soldiers in combat. Most men in combat are not primarily motivated by abstract concepts like patriotism or ideology. They fight for the men next to them, for their squad, their platoon, their company. The bonds formed through shared hardship and danger become stronger than almost any other human connection. A soldier will risk his life not for his country in the abstract, but for the specific men whose names he knows, whose families he's heard about, whose lives are intertwined with his own through the shared experience of combat. Jachman knew the men of Company B. He had trained with them, jumped with them, fought with them. They were his squad, his unit, his family in the way that combat units become families. When he saw them being killed by those tanks, he was watching his brothers die. The decision to act was not a conscious calculation of abstract moral principles. It was the immediate, instinctive response of a man watching his family being destroyed and knowing he had the power to stop it. But instinct alone does not explain what Jachman did. Instinct might drive a man to act. Training and experience allow him to act effectively. Jachman's paratrooper training had ingrained in him a level of weapons proficiency that made operating the bazooka alone, under fire, something he could physically accomplish. His prior combat experience with the 513th had taught him to function under the stress of battle, to maintain fine motor control when adrenaline and fear were screaming at him to flee. The combination of instinct, training, and experience created the conditions where Jachman could do what needed to be done. Even so, the odds of success were low. The bazooka was not a precision weapon. The M6A3 rocket was somewhat erratic in flight, especially in crosswinds. The optical sight required steady aim, difficult to achieve when standing in the open under fire. The tanks were moving targets. Any of a dozen factors could have caused Jachman to miss, in which case he would have died without achieving anything except adding one more casualty to Company B's losses. He succeeded because skill and courage aligned with that element of fortune that determines all military outcomes. The rockets flew true, the shaped charges penetrated. The tanks were disabled at the critical moment. Had any of these factors been different, this story would not exist. Jachman would be listed among the unknown thousands who died in the Bulge, their individual stories lost to history, their deaths recorded only as statistics in casualty reports. Instead, Jachman's action was witnessed, documented, investigated, and ultimately recognized with America's highest military decoration. His story became one of the defining accounts of heroism in the Battle of the Bulge, taught at military academies, studied by historians, commemorated by monuments. The Medal of Honor is awarded so rarely precisely because the standard is so extraordinarily high. During World War II, 16 million Americans served in the military. Of these, 464 received the Medal of Honor, slightly less than 0.03%. More than half of these medals were awarded posthumously, reflecting the reality that the actions that qualify for the Medal of Honor frequently result in the death of the recipient. To receive the Medal of Honor, a soldier must demonstrate conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. The action must involve personal bravery so extraordinary that it stands out even among the many acts of courage that occur routinely in combat. Jachman's action met every element of this definition. Conspicuous gallantry, witnessed by his entire company, visible to both friendly and enemy forces, an action that could not be hidden or minimized. Intrepidity, proceeding with the attack despite knowing the near certainty of death, maintaining focus on the mission while under concentrated enemy fire. Risk of life, not merely accepting risk, but deliberately choosing an action that would almost certainly result in death. Above and beyond the call of duty, exceeding what military regulations or orders required, going far beyond what any reasonable person would expect even of a highly trained combat soldier. The Medal of Honor Citation Board examined Jachman's case through this lens. They reviewed eyewitness statements. They analyzed the tactical situation. They verified that the action occurred as described. They confirmed that Jachman's action directly saved the lives of multiple soldiers and significantly influenced the battle's outcome. Only after this thorough investigation, conducted over several years, did they recommend that Jachman receive the Medal of Honor. The 5-year delay between Jachman's death and the medal presentation reflected the military's careful vetting process, but it also highlighted a deeper issue about how Americans remember and honor their war dead. By 1950, when Jachman's family finally received the Medal of Honor, America had moved on from World War II. The returning veterans had reintegrated into civilian life. The war economy had transitioned to peacetime production. New international crises, particularly the Cold War and the Korean War, dominated public attention. The urgency and unity that characterized the World War II home front had dissipated into the complexity and anxiety of the atomic age. For Jachman's parents, this meant grieving in relative isolation. The community support that surrounded Gold Star families during the war had faded. The news of their son's Medal of Honor came years after they had processed their loss, years after they had built new patterns of life around his permanent absence. The medal was an honor, certainly, but it could not restore what they had lost. It could not bring back their son. It could not undo the fact that Isadore would never marry, never have children, never grow old alongside them. This tension between public honor and private grief characterizes how societies remember fallen soldiers. The monuments, the medals, the ceremonies serve important functions. They acknowledge sacrifice. They preserve memory. They teach subsequent generations about courage and duty. But for the families of the fallen, these public commemorations can never fully address the personal loss, the specific absence of one specific person from their lives. Jachman's story also highlights a particular aspect of American military history that deserves attention. As a Jewish immigrant who fled Nazi Germany and then returned to Europe as an American soldier to fight against the regime that would murder his extended family, Jachman's service took on layers of meaning beyond typical military service. He was fighting not just for American victory, but for the survival of his people. The war was simultaneously a military conflict and an existential struggle against genocidal anti-Semitism. Jachman was one of approximately 550,000 Jewish Americans who served in the U.S. military during World War II. They served in every branch, in every theater, in every type of unit. They won Medals of Honor, Distinguished Service Crosses, Silver Stars, and Bronze Stars in proportion to their service. They fought and died alongside their non-Jewish comrades, united by shared commitment to defeating fascism. For Jewish Americans in World War II, military service carried additional weight. They knew that relatives in Europe were being systematically murdered. They knew that Nazi ideology marked Jews for elimination. They knew that victory in the war was literally a matter of survival for the Jewish people. This knowledge added urgency to their service, a personal stake in the outcome that went beyond patriotism or duty. Jachman's 6 aunts and uncles who died in the Holocaust represented the fate he had escaped by his parents' decision to immigrate. Every German soldier he fought was part of the machinery that had murdered his relatives. Every day of successful resistance against German forces was one day closer to liberating the concentration camps and stopping the genocide. When Jachman picked up that bazooka and charged those tanks, he was fighting for Company B, certainly, but he was also fighting for every Jew who had been or would be murdered by the Nazi regime. This makes his Medal of Honor one of only 3 awarded to Jewish Americans for actions during World War II. The rarity of these awards reflects both the small percentage of Jewish Americans in the total military force and the high standards required for the Medal of Honor, not any deficiency in courage or service. Jewish Americans won thousands of decorations during the war, but only 3 achieved the extraordinarily rare combination of circumstances, action, and documentation required for the Medal of Honor. The other 2 Jewish American Medal of Honor recipients from World War II were Raymond Zussman, killed in action in France in September 1944 after destroying multiple German positions single-handedly, and Ben Salomon, an army dentist who manned a machine gun to cover the evacuation of wounded soldiers on Saipan in July 1944. killing an estimated 98 Japanese soldiers before being killed himself. All 3 medals were awarded posthumously. All 3 recipients died, ensuring that their comrades could survive. All 3 exemplified the highest standards of military courage. Today, Jachman's memory is preserved in multiple ways. The monument in Flamierge stands as a permanent reminder of his sacrifice. The Staff Sergeant Isadore Jachman Armory in Owings Mills, Maryland, named in his honor, serves as a training facility for the Maryland National Guard. His Medal of Honor is displayed at the National Museum of American Jewish Military History in Washington, D.C., where it helps tell the story of Jewish American service in defense of the United States. His name appears on memorial walls, in unit histories, and in scholarly studies of the Battle of the Bulge. But perhaps the most important legacy is less tangible. Jachman's story continues to be taught at military schools as an example of selfless leadership. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers study his action as a case study in making hard decisions under pressure. The question posed to students is simple. If you were in Jachman's position, having seen what needed to be done and knowing what it would cost, would you do it? Most students, being honest, admit they don't know. They hope they would have the courage. They believe they would do their duty. But until you are actually in that moment, facing that choice, you cannot know with certainty how you will respond. This is what makes Jachman's action remarkable. He faced that moment, made that choice, and followed through with the action. He moved from theory to practice, from belief to behavior, from courage imagined to courage demonstrated. The soldiers of Company B who survived January 4th, 1945, carried Jachman's memory with them for the rest of their lives. At unit reunions, his name was spoken with reverence. When they told their children and grandchildren about the war, Jachman's sacrifice featured prominently in their stories. They knew, in a way that others could not fully understand, exactly what Jachman had given them. Given them the opportunity to return home, to marry, to have families, to live full lives. Everything they achieved after January 4th, 1945, existed because Jachman had stopped those tanks. This is the ultimate meaning of Jachman's action. War is often discussed in terms of strategy, tactics, logistics, and casualties. Divisions maneuver. Artillery barrages occur. Casualties are recorded as statistics, but beneath these abstractions are individual human beings making moment-by-moment decisions about how to act in impossible situations. The grand sweep of historical events is built from millions of these individual choices, most never recorded, most forgotten, most disappearing into the general narrative of campaigns and battles. Occasionally, one of these individual choices is witnessed, documented, and preserved. Jachman's choice is one of these rare instances where we can see clearly the moment when a single human being altered the course of events through individual action, not through superhuman abilities, not through special weapons or advantages, simply through the decision to do what needed to be done, regardless of cost. January 4th, 1945, was 80 years ago as of this writing. The soldiers who fought at Flamierge are gone. The last veterans of World War II are in their late 90s or older. Soon, there will be no living memory of the Battle of the Bulge, no first-hand witnesses to what happened on that Belgian ridge. The story will survive only in documents, photographs, monuments, and accounts like this one. This makes the preservation of stories like Jachman's increasingly important. Each generation must learn anew what courage means, what sacrifice requires, what freedom costs. The abstract concepts of duty and honor must be grounded in specific examples of specific people doing specific things. Jachman's story provides that grounding. It shows courage not as an abstract virtue but as a concrete action, running forward through machine gun fire, shouldering a bazooka, engaging tanks while knowing you will not survive. The lessons extend beyond military contexts. In civilian life, people face moments when the right action carries personal cost, when standing up for principle means social or professional consequences, when protecting others means accepting risk, when doing what is necessary means giving up what is comfortable. These are not military situations, but they involve the same fundamental choice. Do I do what is right, or do what is easy? Jachman's example answers that question through action rather than words. He did what was right, he paid the cost. He saved his comrades, he did his duty. These simple facts, when examined closely, reveal the profound truth about how human societies survive and prosper. They survive because, at critical moments, individuals choose to place the welfare of others above their own survival. This is not natural behavior. Evolution did not program humans to sacrifice themselves for non-relatives. Self-preservation is among the strongest biological imperatives. Yet human societies have always depended on individuals who, under certain circumstances, will override self-preservation and accept personal destruction to protect others. Societies cultivate this willingness through military training, through cultural narratives about heroism, through systems of honor and recognition that reward self-sacrifice. But ultimately, cultivation can only go so far. When the moment comes, when the tanks are approaching and someone must stop them, all the training and cultural programming in the world cannot force a person to act. The decision must come from within. Jachman made that decision. This is what earned him the Medal of Honor, not the skill with which he employed the bazooka, though that was considerable, not the tactical significance of stopping 2 tanks, though that was substantial, but the internal decision to accept certain death in order to save others. 80 years later, on another Belgian winter day, you could visit Flamierge. The village has been rebuilt. The scars of war have mostly healed. The forests have regrown. The fields are cultivated. If you didn't know the history, you would see only a quiet Belgian community, unremarkable except for its pastoral setting in the Ardennes highlands. But in the center of the village stands the monument, the bronze figure of an American soldier with a bazooka facing toward where the German tanks approached on January 4, 1945. The inscription bears Isadore Jachman's name. Visitors sometimes leave flowers. School groups on educational tours stop to learn the story. The people of Flamierge have not forgotten. They remember that their freedom came at the cost of American blood, and they honor that debt through their continued remembrance. This is how societies preserve memory across generations. Through monuments and stories, through teaching and commemoration, through the patient work of ensuring that the sacrifices of one generation are understood by subsequent generations. It is never perfect. Details are lost. Nuances disappear. The lived experience of those frozen January days in Patois, 1945, can never be fully recreated for those who were not there. But the essential truth can be transmitted. A man saw his comrades in danger. He had the skill and the courage to help them. He knew helping them would cost his life. He helped them anyway. They lived. He died. This is worth remembering. This is worth teaching. This is worth honoring. Staff Sergeant Isadore Siegfried Jachman, born in Berlin, raised in Baltimore, killed at Flamierge at age 22. Medal of Honor recipient, Jewish American, paratrooper, hero. His 90 seconds of action on January 4th, 1945, influenced the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge, saved the lives of dozens of men in Company B, and provided an example of courage that continues to inspire 80 years later. The 2 German tanks he destroyed with a bazooka, firing alone under concentrated enemy fire, knowing he would not survive, represent one of the most extraordinary individual achievements in the entire history of the American military. This is his story. This is what he did. This is why we remember. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.